In this video, we're discussing a couple of concepts. We're going to focus on the segments of fixed income instruments, investors who make it their natural choice to buy securities from the various segments. We'll talk a little about ratings and bond indices, or indexes as your curriculum calls it. So let's get started with the segments. And I'm going to base this discussion on a replica of a table that you'll find in the curriculum, or you may find in the curriculum. There isn't much discussion of that table, so I'll try to provide the relevant commentary here to the extent I think it's needed. So as you can see, I'm drawing a table just as if we were in a spreadsheet. Over here, I'm going to have the issuer type, or actually an axis that depicts the credit quality of the issuer. And the funny thing is, as we go this way, the credit quality is going to deteriorate. Sorry. Now, at the top, we're going to have sovereign issuers. So basically bonds that are issued by countries or governments of countries. And the assumption that we're going to make is that these are free of any risk of default. So default risk free. And that's a good assumption to be making in the CFA exam, that typically sovereign bonds are default risk-free. In reality, that's not necessarily always the case. Now, the next two groups that we're going to have here are more associated sort of with corporate issuers. Corporate, although not necessarily only, this could also be to do with municipal issuers, but the idea is mainly corporate issuers fall into these two categories, namely investment grade issuers, grade issuers, and then immediately below, we're going to say high yield issuers. And the difference between them will be explained in a later part of this video when we discuss ratings, credit ratings. It's all about the difference between better quality and lower quality issuers in terms of how the quality is estimated, typically by rating agencies. Now, on the horizontal axis, as we go along this way, we're going to be increasing the tenor of the instruments, the fixed income instruments. In other words, their time to maturity. Okay, and we will be making the following, we'll have the following headings in the individual columns, starting here with tenors that are less than 1 year, less than 1 year, i.e. short-term securities. Then tenors of anywhere between 1 year and 10 years, which your book refers to as intermediate, sort of term securities. This ST is, of course, short term, I did say that, and more than 10 years, which naturally will be called long-term LT. Right, let's start with the very simple names of securities issued by sovereign issuers that fall into these individual segments. When countries issue short-term debt with a maturity of maximum 1 year, we typically call this bills. So the security itself is actually called a treasury bill. And if you watch these, if you observe these in the market, you'll often see that the word treasury is actually abbreviated to just the letter T. T-bills are bills issued by a treasury, so by a country such as the US, for example. Now, Intermediate term securities issued by governments are typically called notes or treasury notes. And we typically reserve the word bond to denote those securities which really have a long tenor or a long time to maturity, definitely more than 10 years. So these will be treasury bonds. Hence, fixed income securities issued by treasuries will often be described using these specific words. Now, how about investment grade, so good quality corporate issuers? When they want to get short-term funding, for example, for just a few days or a couple of weeks, they often engage in something called the repo or the repurchase agreement, which we will have separate videos about later on. This is also a very popular transaction among financial institutions. It's a form of collateralized borrowing. More on that in separate videos. We also see corporate issuers issuing something called commercial paper. Commercial paper is short-term securities. So kind of the equivalent of treasury bills, but in the world of corporates. And these are especially common among those corporates who want to get funding so as to finance their working capital. So let me maybe say over here that this is especially popular, especially to fund investments in working capital. So for example, to purchase inventory that you need in your production processes. Okay, one more here, and that's going to be an acronym. ABCP, this stands for asset-backed commercial paper. And asset-backed security is something we'll be talking about later on in the fixed income section of the curriculum. For now, let's just say that these are types of fixed income instruments of a short-term nature, hence commercial paper, and they fit in this column. But the idea of being asset-backed is that their performance, how much they give you as an investor, will be a function of the performance of a specific asset. Such as, I don't know, any asset could be, any asset that generates a stream of income can be used as backing for fixed income asset-backed securities. Now, high yield issuers or high yield, high yield issuers, those with a low credit quality assessment or rating, typically do not borrow money short term. So they do indeed, take part in this market as issuers, but more in the medium and long term sort of columns. Now, if you're a good quality investment grade borrower, you'll typically be able to issue unsecured notes or bonds. Using the word note or bond isn't necessarily extremely important, but the idea is borrowing unsecured, even for longer periods of time. That is not going to be the case for these high yield issuers. If they want to borrow money, it will have to be secured. So they'll need to provide collateral. So that they may issue secured bonds, but always with collateral built into them. And they often also resort to taking something called leveraged loans. Now, these are loans, as the name suggests, so it's not the issue of a security that's going to be tradable. Leveraged in finance can mean lots of different things, but in this context, it's a bit of a synonym for high yield. Leveraged loans are those. It's a phrase that we use to describe loans taken by lower quality issuers, basically. It's a bit confusing, that word. Now, let's go over here. I've left some space intentionally because I want to tell you that investment grade borrowers also issue asset-backed securities. These are longer-term debt securities whose performance is going to be linked to the cash flows on them, to the performance of on a specific asset. This could be a building which is being rented out to tenants, and depending on the rental income, a bond produces either higher or lower coupons to investors who acquired it. That's an example of such an asset-backed security. In the case of securities issued for even a longer term, what you'll often see is that these merge into or get transformed into MBSs, where the backing is a pool of mortgage loans. Not just any other asset, but a selection of mortgage or collection of mortgage loans. And this is especially done by banks, where depending on how a portfolio of borrowers are paying their loans or indeed not, their mortgage loans, and how they are behaving, these securities accordingly react by providing higher or lower cash flows to their holders, to their investors. Okay, good. I'm going to wipe some things off, and then we can move into a discussion of who buys these things. So who are the investors who typically hold such securities? Okay, same or almost the same table as before, with the tenors going across here and the lowering, deteriorating credit quality in the rows. And now we're going to think about who invests in the particular sort of segments or these individual cells. Let's start at the top: sovereign bonds or sovereign debt. Sovereign bills, notes, or treasury bills, notes, and bonds are a particular favorite among financial institutions, especially banks. So financial intermediaries, which is a fancy word to say banks, are very happy to invest, especially in short-term sovereign debt, because short-term bonds have a tendency to be quite stable in terms of their valuations. Even when interest rates change, they don't typically fluctuate that much. But anything here is kind of is possible. Also, central banks, which we'll talk about a little bit in just a moment, like holding these types of sovereign issued security. The reason why central banks are going to be quite keen to invest in sovereign bonds is multifold, and your book does provide some important arguments for it. So, sovereign debt, sovereign fixed income securities are typically considered to be default risk-free, so free of the risk that the issuer will not make the promised payments. As I said before, that's not always the case, but let's assume it for the sake of, the fact that we're dealing with the CFA curriculum and we have to conform to what is said there. And now the arguments for holding these. If such instruments, if issued by the government of a developed country, the US, for example, springs to mind quite immediately as one of those issuers, definitely from a developed country. It's often going to be held, that security that is often held by foreign central banks. So the central banks of other countries other than the country of the issuer, other than the US in this case, as a form of reserve. So as reserves or an investment in what you purchase using so-called reserve currency. More on that, I guess, when we get to the section in economics about monetary policy or what central banks do. And additionally to this, Central banks also hold their own country's sovereign bonds, domestic sovereign debt. They do this as part of their monetary policy operations, as part of monetary policy tools. Monetary policy, basically by either buying, borrowing, selling bonds, they try to influence the supply of money in the economy, and it's an important tool. But as a sort of side effect, they do end up a lot of the time holding sovereign bonds of their own country, so to speak. Okay, now both investment grade and sovereign short-term securities are often held by the managers of money market funds. So that's something which you'll find both here and here. And actually, corporates, companies, including financial institutions, often also hold short-term debt issued by investment grade borrowers. To be honest, they also hold short-term debt issued by sovereigns. I mean, anything goes here. There is no sort of, there are no red flags here prohibiting somebody from investing. So we're making certain generalizations based on a table that you'll find in your curriculum, which isn't necessarily hugely discussed. We said before that high yield issuers, do not necessarily issue short-term debt. So we're going to have an empty cell over here. Now, what about this? Intermediate term investment grade debt, typically coming from corporate issuers. Well, this is going to be held by, various bond funds, including exchange traded funds. More on these in just a moment. And also, asset managers, people who look after other people's wealth, money, by running collective funds. They will be buying intermediate term investment grade bonds. Some of them may even venture into the sort of more high yield area if the clients or the investors are willing to do so, willing to take that additional risk. However, this generally, this space of high yield will often be the domain of hedge funds, who often are associated with, taking the willingness to take that extra risk and obviously get the expected reward for it, the higher yield. Higher yield, that name comes from the fact that because of the credit quality being lower, investors here do indeed expect to be rewarded for it appropriately with a higher yield. And there are also specialist funds which invest in so-called distressed debt. So distressed debt funds are a type of fund that you'll typically talk about under alternative investments. So our hedge funds, they're not the classic, they're not your classic sort of asset management, which sticks to better quality issues. Now, here in the long-term sector, let's just say that this is a favorite spot for long-term investors like pension funds. And also insurance companies, especially life insurance companies. Why is this a good place to be? Well, because these types of entities have relatively long-term obligations or obligations which are far away, be it pension obligations or, for example, pensions obligations which arise from life insurance. And long-term securities are a way to put that money to work and be certain that the cash flow in the future will come on a specific date. And in the meantime, also the receipt of coupons, especially if they are fixed, will very often allow us to match income with our obligation stream. Let's now focus our attention on the ratings, more specifically credit ratings, as provided by so-called rating agencies. And later you'll learn about those agencies: Moody's, Standard and Poor's, S&P, and Fitch. For now, let's just say that ratings are a measure of an issuer's ability to meet their debt obligations. Issuers' ability to meet their debt obligations, obviously arising on the bonds that they have issued. Okay, let me also state that these ratings are going to be based on two important numbers or metrics. That is the PD, the probability of default. So how likely is it that an issuer will get into trouble and miss payments on a bond? That's default. So PD here. And also the second one, LGD, loss given default. How severe will the losses be to bondholders if such an event does, called default, occur? More on that in specific, future videos on credit risk. Good. Let's say over here that the agencies, the rating agencies, provide ratings, two types of ratings. Rating agencies give or issue or provide ratings for both the issuers, so a specific government, a specific company, but also specific issues coming from these issuers. So this bond or this note, because each of those bonds may have different features, including, for example, different terms under which they may be secured or how they rank in a, they may be subordinated. They may rank higher or lower in that hierarchy of getting money if something bad happens. Now, rating agencies always use, when they provide these scores or these ratings, they use a scale. And although the scales actually differ by agency, what you'll typically have is the highest rating being something called the AAA. So this is a sign of the best quality. Then you've got AA, single A, triple B, double B, and and so on. The credit quality is getting lower. In between these letters, you'll also have things like AA plus, AA minus, so variations as well, smaller steps. Now, what's really, really important is the difference between triple B minus and double B plus, because that is the cutoff point for deciding whether we're dealing with an investment grade issuer or what we previously described as high yield. So over here, the good quality grades are so-called investment grades. So they are given to investment grade issuers. And what was previously described as high yield is associated with issuers who get lower scores, or scores of double B plus or less. So this is the high yield territory. Some people call this junk. This sounds much nicer. Okay, so who will get these lower scores? Well, they will be given or granted to issuers with less definitely stable operating cash flows. Operating cash flows are the cash flows used by a company, by an issuer, to service their debt, coupon payments on bonds, for example. And if those cash flows are quite volatile, unstable, then obviously investors will be a little bit wary of investing into such things, into such issues. They will typically require quite a good coupon rate, so quite a high yield. And investors will often also expect, or typically expect, these to be collateralized, secured on some assets. Just in case things go wrong, there are specific assets pledged to act as a source of cash flow to repay these debts. Now, sometimes you get so-called fallen angels. Fallen angels are issuers who used to be up here, but they've fallen below the threshold point, and now they are in the high yield category. So just be aware of that name. It may come up in a theoretical question. The final segment, or the final concept I want to talk about, are fixed income indexes or indices. So fixed income indexes. And your curriculum focuses especially on the difference that you'll observe with fixed income indexes in relation to equity indices, so indexes of stocks. So let me write over here, the most important differences to equity indexes. That's the focus point. And there are three important sort of points which are made, and you have to appreciate them and perhaps be able to, answer questions about them. First of all, unlike equity indices, bond indexes will typically have a lot of constituent components, so they will contain many issues. And many issues coming from a single issuer. Now, a single issuer, think about a corporate, a company, right, will have typically a single one type of ordinary share, which may be included in an index, an equity index. But a single company may have plenty of bond issues, each issued at different points in time with different coupons, different time to maturity or tenor, different features, etc. So a single issuer may provide lots of components into a bond index. And the idea is, if you've created a bond index or any index and you've set up certain screening criteria for inclusion in the index, once an issuer meets those criteria, you'll have to include all of their eligible bonds into the index. So let me write that. All bonds meeting the index criteria. Maybe you've got an index which only includes bonds that have a time to maturity in between 1 and 5 years. So if an issuer has such bonds, you have to include all of them in that index. Must be included. You can't, just rule something out in the index. Hence, the idea of many issues or many constituents. Constituents are the members of an index. Constituents. Good. Now, next point. A much higher turnover is going to be expected with bond index constituents than equity index constituents, in the sense, how much rotation there is, how much replacement there is going on. This is due to the fact that in the world of bonds, we typically have many changes. Why do we have many changes? Well, many changes in the constituents of an index because some bonds are maturing due to maturities, or perhaps just simply getting closer to their maturity. And once again, if you've set up an index which only covers or only holds bonds with in between 1 year and 5 years until maturity, once a certain bond becomes close enough to its maturity date to fall under the radar, you'll have to exclude it from the index. But also, there are plenty of new issues coming to the market as well all the time, which you'll have to screen against the index criteria and see whether they are eligible or not and should be included or perhaps not. You've got to be objective. So this creates a need for what your curriculum calls frequent rebalancing, mainly, meaning a look at the list of constituents at potentially, dropping some, including some others. That's what we mean by rebalancing, which will also have to be reflected in the portfolio of somebody who wants to invest alongside the index or in a way that matches the index. And this is typically monthly. So this kind of official rebalancing typically happens monthly in the world of bonds. Okay. And one more thing, although that's not necessarily so different to what you'd get in an equity index fund, although, well, kind of. These things, these indexes, or how much of an index a certain issue occupies, is weighted by the bond value. Different bond issues have different sort of sizes, and especially big issuers are governments. Governments issue lots of bonds with huge amounts. So if you've got a very broad index of bonds, which will include government bonds, that will typically mean that a large proportion of an index, large proportion of a sort of broad index may be occupied by sovereign or treasury securities. Large proportion of a broad index taken up by government issues or government debt, which is, which may be a good thing, it may be a bad thing, but it's something to take into account. What is more, if you try to, because, the thing is, how do we use indices? Indices or indexes are used either to try and replicate the index in a bond in a securities portfolio, so as to try and get a match and get performance which matches that of the index, or it may be used as a benchmark to assess your portfolio performance against a chosen index to see whether you're doing better, worse, the same. The latter strategy will in particular be adopted by active managers. However, if you tried to replicate the index by buying all the components, all the constituents, so this is buying all the constituents of a bond index, given how many such constituents there are, this goes into thousands, it's going to be virtually impossible. Or if you try to do it, it would be very costly. These securities are often not very liquid, so you'd incur very high bid-ask spread costs, etc. So what you typically resort to is some form of sampling. You don't buy everything into your portfolio. You sample and include some securities while submitting others. More on how this is done, we cover also in quantitative methods in the video on sampling. This is sampling methods. This is something called stratified random sampling. You create so-called strata, and that's how you choose the bonds for inclusion in your portfolio. So, like we said before, or just a moment ago, about how these indexes or indices are used. Either as a recipe for creating a portfolio or as something to measure yourself against. And now, if you're a portfolio manager, somebody who manages a fund, obviously a fund of bonds, and you want to see how want to measure how your fund is doing in relation to something, that something being a benchmark, you'll have to select an index. If you're managing an equity fund focused on American securities, maybe you measure yourself against the S&P 500 as a sort of broad market index. In the world of bonds, you have to choose the right index as well. Indexes may come in a very sort of broad version. We call them aggregate indexes, or broad index containing lots of issues, or they may be more narrow with a focusing on, for example, specific credit qualities. So not all bonds, but only bonds with a certain range of credit quality as measured by the rating, or maybe specific maturities, like I told you before, maybe in between 1 to 5 years in terms of the time remaining to maturity, or maybe specific issuers coming from a specific country or geographical region, or maybe those who conform to ESG criteria. You name it. You can have lots of different indexes, and whichever index you choose to act as the benchmark chosen by our fund manager, absolutely must reflect their own strategy. So if you've got a fund that focuses on investing in bonds of maybe lower quality issuers, well, don't measure yourself against an aggregate index. Measure yourself against an index which also has that kind of focus. It has to be, that match has to be maintained. And yeah, I think that's all we need to know for now about these various areas. See you in the next video.